On a summer morning in July 2013, 24-year-old Amy Lord left her South Boston apartment before sunrise, heading to the gym before work. She never made it inside. Within hours, surveillance cameras across the city would capture fragments of her final moments, terrified, injured, being forced from one bank machine to another by an unseen captor. By that evening, her body would be discovered in the woods of Hyde Park, the victim of unthinkable violence. But Amy wasn't the only woman targeted that day. In a span of just 20 hours, one man would terrorize 3 young women in a rampage that would shake Boston to its core.
This is so hard. Something that someone shouldn't ever have to do and come up here and speak. But I won, and he didn't win. And I didn't get this until yesterday from Cindy Lord, and I had no idea that this was, Amy had this. Amy had this around her neck, and now I have one too because I carry her on my shoulder everywhere I go. Everything that I do for the rest of my life, she's going to be with me every step of the way. She's my guardian angel, and she helped me fight and do what I did.
This is the story of a senseless crime spree, of lives forever changed, and of a survivor who would eventually find an unexpected path toward healing. It's a story that reminds us how fragile safety can be, and how quickly an ordinary day can turn into a nightmare. This story really gave me the chill as I researched it. Amy Beth Lord was born in December to parents Dennis and Cynthia. She grew up in the quiet town of Wilbraham with her 2 younger sisters, Kimberly and Carly, in a close-knit family that valued hard work, integrity, and kindness. From an early age, Amy was full of energy and determination. After graduating from high school, Amy attended Bentley University, where she earned her bachelor's degree in marketing and liberal studies in 2011. After college, she landed a position as an online marketing specialist at Genuine Interactive, a digital marketing firm in Boston. By all accounts, she loved her work and threw herself into it with characteristic enthusiasm. In the summer of 2013, Amy was living her best life. She had an apartment on Dorchester Street in South Boston, a neighborhood known for its tight community feel despite being part of a major city. She had a loving boyfriend, a circle of devoted friends, and a career that was just beginning to take off. At 24, the world felt full of possibilities. Her family would later recall that Amy was someone who always showed up on time, who kept her commitments, who made everyone around her feel valued and heard. She was, by all measures, exactly where she wanted to be.
She was just so very sure of herself and what she wanted to do. She had big dreams and she was headed right in the direction of them.
But on the morning of July 23rd, everything changed. The sun hadn't yet risen over South Boston when the violence began. At 4:23 in the morning, while most of the city still slept, a 22-year-old woman named Alexandra Cruz was walking to her early shift at Dunkin' Donuts. The streets were dark and quiet. Cruz, a single mother, had left her young son with a babysitter, just as she did every morning. But on this particular morning, someone was following her. Without warning, a man struck her in the jaw with such force that she briefly lost consciousness. When she came to her consciousness, she was being dragged into a parking lot, the man's hands around her throat. He told her if she screamed, he would kill her. The words he used were chilling in their directness and brutality. Cruz fought back with everything she had, and somehow, miraculously, she managed to break free and run. She kept running all the way to work, where she immediately called the police. She gave them a description of her attacker, a Hispanic male with a distinctive mole on his lip, someone who seemed to be prowling the neighborhood in the pre-dawn darkness.
Pulled the incident report, and there was a description of an individual from Alexandra Cruz, a Hispanic male. One of the particular things that she talked about was that he had a mole on his lip, As a result, I did a query in our booking system. From that query, I came up with about 10 possibilities. And I pulled a picture of a guy who lived in South Boston and put it in my pocket.
Just over an hour later, around 5:38 in the morning, Amy Lord was preparing to leave her apartment. She'd already changed into her workout clothes and was ready to head to the gym before her shift at work. Surveillance footage from a building across the street would later reveal what happened next. A man can be seen walking past Amy's building, then pausing at the glass door. He appears to peer inside, as if waiting. When Amy opens the door to leave, he suddenly rushes forward, forcing his way in and shoving her back inside. The door closes behind them. For approximately 15 minutes, Amy was trapped in the vestibule of her own building with her attacker. The details of those minutes can only be imagined, but when the two emerged, Amy's face was visibly swollen, her left eye darkening with bruising. The man was leading her toward her black Jeep Cherokee. What followed was a nightmare journey across South Boston and into Dorchester. Between 6:03 and 6:47 that morning, Amy was forced to stop at 5 different ATMs. Security cameras captured her getting out of her vehicle, walking to the machines, withdrawing money. In the early footage, she appears relatively composed, though careful observers would notice the injuries to her face. But as the morning wore on, the terror became more apparent. At one bank, she looked directly into the camera, a silent, desperate plea for someone, anyone, to notice something was wrong. The man driving her car was careful to avoid being filmed. He pulled his shirt up over his face, turned away from cameras, kept his baseball cap low. But in one brief moment at Metro Credit Union, he removed his cap, revealing a closely shaved head. It wasn't much, but it would prove to be crucial evidence. In total, Amy was forced to withdraw $960 every cent available in her accounts. After the final ATM withdrawal in Dorchester, Amy's Jeep headed south toward Hyde Park, a neighborhood on the outskirts of Boston. The vehicle made its way to Stony Brook Reservation, a wooded area with quiet walking paths far from the busy streets where Amy had spent her morning. What happened in those woods would haunt investigators for years to come. Amy was beaten. She was stripped of her clothing. She was assaulted with a knife more than 40 times. She was choked, and then her body was left on an isolated path, hidden among the trees, with only an angel wing necklace, a gift from her mother, still around her neck. The level of violence was overwhelming, senseless. After murdering Amy, her killer drove her Jeep back to South Boston. At 8:45 that morning, witnesses reported seeing a vehicle engulfed in flames in a parking lot. By the time firefighters arrived, the SUV was burned beyond recognition. It would take hours to trace the vehicle identification number and connect it to Amy Lord. Meanwhile, at Genuine Interactive, Amy's co-workers were growing increasingly worried. 9 o'clock came and went, then 10. Amy's phone went straight to voicemail. Her manager, knowing how reliable she was, felt a knot of dread forming in his stomach. By 11 o'clock, he made the call to police, requesting a welfare check. Amy's parents, Dennis and Cynthia, received a call from their daughter's boss shortly after. Something was wrong. Very wrong. They immediately drove the 90 minutes from Wilbraham to Boston, their minds racing through possibilities, none of them good. When police entered Amy's apartment with her family, everything appeared normal. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle inside her home. But in the building's lobby, investigators found small but telling details. A contact lens on the floor, and what appeared to be impact marks on the wall. Amy wore contact lenses. Someone had clearly been hurt in that space. Detectives requested Amy's recent bank records, hoping her transactions might provide clues to her whereabouts. Detectives requested surveillance footage from each location, knowing it might take hours for the files to arrive. While they waited, Detective Bobby Flynn from the South Boston precinct obtained video from the building across from Amy's apartment. The footage quality was poor, grainy, but it showed enough. A male figure walking past Amy's door, pausing, then rushing forward as the door opened, Amy being pushed back inside. The timestamp read 5:37 in the morning. Then, at approximately 4 o'clock that afternoon, everything changed. A cyclist riding through Stony Brook Reservation in Hyde Park noticed something disturbing in the undergrowth near one of the trails. He called 911 immediately. When officers arrived at the scene, they found Amy's body. The young woman who'd been reported missing just hours earlier, who'd been seen on security cameras that very morning, was gone. Detective McLaughlin arrived at the scene as quickly as he could. Standing there in the woods, looking at the brutalized body of a woman the same age as his own daughter, he felt the weight of what this case represented. Someone had done this in broad daylight, in a city full of people, and then simply disappeared into the crowds. But he couldn't afford to dwell on the horror. There was work to do, and fast. As news of Amy Lord's murder spread across Boston that evening, a sense of unease settled over South Boston. Police issued warnings for women to stay indoors or walk in pairs. A violent predator was on the loose, and no one knew where he might strike next or who he might target. The ATM footage had given investigators precious little to work, with a partial glimpse of a man with a shaved head, always obscured by hats or clothing. But it was something. Detective McLaughlin worked through the evening, requesting surveillance footage from every business and building between where Alexandra Cruz had been attacked and Amy's apartment. The cameras showed a man making loops around the neighborhood, appearing and reappearing on different streets at different times. The proximity and timing suggested strongly that the same person had attacked Cruz and then, just over an hour later, abducted Amy. Now they knew they were looking for a serial attacker, and potentially a killer who might not be finished. What investigators didn't know was that the suspect had spent the entire day drinking and socializing with friends. Security footage from across the city would later show him buying gasoline shortly after Amy's murder, using her money to purchase lottery tickets, cigarettes, and beer. He bought a new cell phone and signed the paperwork under the name Slim Shady, an act of bizarre bravado that seemed disconnected from the gravity of what he'd done. He treated friends to dinner at a Chinese restaurant, where cameras captured him laughing and smoking outside as if he didn't have a care in the world. Later that evening, he returned to his girlfriend's apartment in South Boston, drunk and aggressive. They argued she was angry that he'd missed their daughter's doctor appointment, frustrated by his behavior. He became increasingly volatile, yelling incoherently, smashing his new phone, and storming into their 4-year-old daughter's room. His girlfriend grabbed their child and fled to her car, frightened by his rage. He left the apartment shortly after, wandering back into the South Boston streets. 21-year-old Kaylee Ballantyne had spent that day working in Cambridge, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding in her neighborhood. She'd moved to Boston from a small town in Maine just 3 months earlier, excited to spend the summer balancing an internship, a restaurant job, and field hockey training. Her mother, Kim, had helped her move in back in May, showing her how to navigate the subway system and which train lines would get her to work. Kim had been worried about her daughter living in a big city, but Kaylee was independent and confident. Boston had been good to her so far. On the night of July 23rd, Kaylee finished her shift late and took the T back to South Boston. She got off at Broadway Station and walked the short distance to her apartment on Gate Street, less than a mile from where Amy Lord had been abducted that morning. It was nearly midnight when she reached her building. She punched in her security code at the entrance, but in her haste, she hit the wrong buttons. Behind her, she sensed movement. She tried the code again, glancing over her shoulder. Someone was approaching, moving quickly. The door finally unlocked. She pushed it open, thinking she'd made it to safety. She was wrong. The man shoved her from behind with such force that she crashed to the ground inside the entryway. Before she could process what was happening, he was on top of her, stabbing her repeatedly. She felt the knife entering her arm, her face, her torso. 5 wounds to her left arm, 2 to her face, 2 more to her torso, 1 of which collapsed her lung, 1 to the top of her head. She screamed with everything she had, kicking wildly, fighting for her life. One of her kicks connected hard enough to knock her attacker off balance. He stumbled, and in that brief moment of disorientation, he made a decision. He ran. Kaylee's roommates heard the screaming and came running down the stairs. They found her on the floor, surrounded by blood, barely conscious. They called 911 immediately. As paramedics rushed Kaylee to Tufts Medical Center, police noticed something crucial, a trail of blood leading away from the scene that wasn't Kaylee's. The attacker had cut himself during the assault. Detective Bobby Flynn and Detective McLaughlin were still processing the scene at Amy Lord's apartment when the call came in about the stabbing on Gate Street. It was just 500 yards away from where they stood. They exchanged glances, the same thought running through both their minds. Not again. They rushed to the scene, and as Flynn walked through the investigation, he received another call from dispatch. A man matching the suspect's description with tattoos, a tank top, and an injured hand had just walked into the emergency room at Tufts Medical Center, the same hospital where Kaylee Ballantyne was being treated. Flynn's blood ran cold. The suspect was in the same building as his victim. He yelled to his partner, and they raced to the hospital with lights and sirens blazing. When Flynn entered Kaylee's room, she grabbed his arm with surprising strength despite her injuries. She'd heard staff members whispering that someone matching her attacker's description was in the hospital. She was terrified he'd come for her again. Meanwhile, an EMT who had heard Kaylee describe her attacker had spotted the man in the hallway, a young Hispanic male with visible tattoos, wearing a tank top with a badly cut hand. The hospital went into lockdown. Security and police quickly located him. His name was Edwin Alemany, 28 years old, a resident of South Boston. He'd come to the emergency room seeking treatment for the gash on his hand, the wound he'd sustained while stabbing Kaylee. Detective Flynn brought Alemany into a separate room for questioning. Alemany denied everything, claiming he'd been in a fight with someone at a gas station. He had no recollection of attacking anyone, he said. But his story fell apart immediately. Surveillance footage from gas stations showed no such altercation. And when McLaughlin pulled out the photograph he'd been carrying in his pocket, the suspect from the Alexandra Cruz case, everyone recognized the man in custody. It was Edwin Alemany. Forensic evidence quickly sealed the case. DNA specialists found Amy Lord's blood on Alemany's sneakers. Surveillance footage showed him driving her Jeep throughout the day, buying gasoline, spending her money. Cameras captured him crossing paths with an acquaintance at the gas station, who would later positively identify him. The evidence was overwhelming. As Kaylee lay in her hospital bed recovering from 9 stab wounds, detectives made the difficult decision to withhold information about Amy Lord's death for several days. They wanted to give Kaylee time to process her own trauma before revealing that she'd survived an encounter with a murderer. But when Detective Flynn finally told her, the news devastated her. She'd been feeling a sense of pride for having survived, for having fought back. Now she was consumed with guilt. Why had she lived when Amy hadn't? What made her worthy of survival? Edwin Alemany's background painted a disturbing picture. Born in 1984, he'd struggled with severe mental illness from childhood hallucinations, depression, and psychological disorders that led to multiple psychiatric hospitalizations as a teenager. He'd been in and out of the Department of Youth Services until he turned 18, at which point the system no longer had authority over him. After that, he cycled between psychiatric facilities and jail cells, arrested 14 times over 10 years for trespassing, assault, and threats of violence. He'd stopped taking his medications. Despite his history, He had a girlfriend, a 4-year-old daughter, and a family who described him as a loving son. In June 2015, Alimony went to trial. His defense attorney argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, that his long history of untreated mental illness meant he couldn't be held criminally responsible for his actions. Prosecutors presented a different narrative, that Alimony had acted with clarity and purpose, that the evidence showed premeditation and deliberate cruelty. After 3 weeks of testimony and just 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder on all theories: premeditation, extreme atrocity and cruelty, and felony murder. He was also convicted of armed robbery, kidnapping, carjacking, and attempted murder in connection with the attacks on Amy, Alexandra, and Kaylee. At the sentencing hearing, Kaylee Ballantyne stood before the court. She'd prepared written remarks, but found she couldn't read them. Instead, she spoke from her heart.
This is so hard. Something that someone shouldn't ever have to do, and come up here and speak. But I won, and he didn't win. And I didn't get this until yesterday from Cindy Lord, and I had no idea that this was, Amy had this around her neck, and now I have one too, because I carry her on my shoulder everywhere I go. Everything that I do for the rest of my life, she's going to be with me every step of the way. She's my guardian angel, and she helped me fight and do what I did.
Judge Frank Gaziano sentenced Edwin Alimony to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder. In 2021, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court upheld his conviction, rejecting his claims that his trial had been unfair. In 2022, he filed a federal habeas corpus petition, arguing that his attorneys had violated his rights by pursuing an insanity defense against his wishes. That petition was denied. In the years that followed, Kaylee found her path forward through an unexpected choice forgiveness. She reached out to Detective Flynn, telling him she wanted to write to Alimony. Flynn was stunned, warning her that nothing good could come from it. But Kaylee persisted. During a church service in Maine, a sermon about forgiveness resonated deeply with her. The pastor, who happened to do chaplaincy work at the prison where Alimony was held, helped her deliver her letter. 2 weeks later, Kaylee received a response. The details of that correspondence remain private, but for Kaylee, the act of forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had been done to her or to Amy. It was about reclaiming power over her own life. She'd spent years defined by hatred and fear, and forgiveness became the tool that allowed her to move forward with peace.